Alrighty then, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Quality Candor, the podcast, episode 9, on a Wednesday for one time only. Just be glad it's not coming out at the end of the month. It's coming out a week before the end of the month. Anyway, so, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to talk about that little trailer I ran at the top of the hour. It could be 2. I don't know how long I'm going to be yammering on about this because there's a lot to yammer on about, but we are going to be talking about the many inspirations and influences that went into my little pulp sci-fi madhouse 365 Infantry. Now, for those who don't know, 365 Infantry is a quarterly sci-fi hero pulp magazine project. I call it a power hour type of series because we run 4 narratives as well as 1 anthology. And we do 5 and so we're doing 5 stories every quarter. Everything from the wartime action of the war to the strange psychological adventures of the hunt to the cyberpunk action comedy of Urban Avenger or the hard-boiled western noir heavy metal nonsense of Speed Freak Files. Long story short, this is a series that is near and dear to me. Tells this grand, expansive story of fighting for freedom in the 25th century against the electric tyranny of a AI network gone completely insane, and fighting the good fight the only way you can. With hot rods, motorcycles, pew-pew laser guns, and plenty of heavy metal to go around. And did I mention they're all wolves? Because wolves are cool, and so are muscle cars, and so are Smith & Wessons. This series is literally everything good in life. You should back. And that is the best damn pitch I'm going to give for this show. I shit you not, I've been doing take after take of trying to explain this series. But the blessing and curse is that it's a lot to explain, but it really isn't a lot in practice. 365 Infantry at its core is no different than Marvel's run of Conan, or the old Gold Key Dell comics, stuff like Turok Son of Stone, in the sense that it's meant to be regular, consistent, entertaining fiction. We have a lot of stuff we talk about. We have a lot of, big ideas, big messages about the nature of liberty, about the nature of finding purpose in the world. The hunt, I mentioned this on Twitter /expialidocious, that the hunt does stem from my own personal issues with mental health, although I'm not going to really go too far into that because it can all be summed up in the sense that 2020 to 2022 to including 2023, to be frank, was basically the first 4 years of my adult life have not been happy times. But at the same time, I found a lot to live for in that time, and I still do, I am still here today to talk with you all about this magical little thing I've been putting my heart and soul into for the past 3-4 years. And we're going to be doing it the way we do best on Quality Candor, which is me rambling about cool old shit. Because that's pretty much what this entire series is based around. It's a bunch of cool old shit that's been inspiring me, that's been really invigorating me, exciting me. This is almost going to be a bit like the way they do, the way they describe production design for Miami Vice, where literally Michael Mann had someone standing around who'd say Vice, not Vice, on every option presented to him by the production team. It's like, what kind of cars are Vice? What kind of wardrobe is Vice? That sort of thing. That's kind of the core thesis of 365 Infantry. It is aesthetically built on the rule of cool, but thematically it pulls a lot from new wave speculative fiction, the work of Harlan Ellison. There is quite a bit of the old pulp mold and pulp practices. I've talked about Walter B. Gibson before on this channel, and he has been an incredible influence and inspiration as far as work ethic goes. If I had the stamina, I could do 2 novels a month of 365 Infantry, or rather, Probably a pared down version, because I know there are some magazines that have gone monthly. Savage Realms Monthly is a sword and sorcery magazine that's been able to keep pace by hook or by crook, and I don't know which, but I salute you all good sirs, including my bud Moose Matson, who actually does the audiobooks for Savage Realms. But I could do this series as long as human. I could do the if I want. Well, for Christ's sakes, I write weekly flash fiction stories for this series, so technically I'm already dishing out at least one adventure every week for the duration that I run my newsletters on the project, which is essentially 2 months in lead up to the release of the magazine, and then the magazine releases, and then I go on a quick break, and then I'm right back where I started. But this series is inspired by that old pulp model of produce, produce, produce. But at the same time, within the confines of what we can afford in terms of print costs, within the confines of what I can handle as a creative, but also as a freelancer who's working on other people's projects all the time. But the long and short of it is, this series is really pure old school pulp entertainment, and with a lot going into its little crucible of influences. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So buckle up, you fucks. To quote one of the motivationals I've been putting out for this godforsaken series, we are going to be running the gauntlet and going pedal to the floor on everything that has made 365 Infantry the post-apocalypse cyberpunk madhouse you know and will hopefully love by the end of this show. And just a word to the wise, this is probably going to be the least edited of all these shows. It's probably going to be the most live feeling I've ever done a podcast like this before, and that's just because there is so much I'm going to be pinballing from, I'm going to be going back and forth over, that I really do just have to lock myself in and just go. So that is your fair warning. You may hear more ums and ahs than usual. Apologies for that. We're going to try and keep them to a minimum. However, the information must flow. Now, when I initially set out to do this episode, I pitched it as an AMA. Ask me anything. Ask me on Twitter/X. Ask me on Substack. And I only got 3 questions. That said, those 3 questions are probably the best way to organize the train of thought I'm about to take you all on. And those 3 came from friend of the Force, JD Cohen, who wrote in, "Why Wolves?" And the other 2 come from a reader, Faye Astras, who asks, "Which one of your characters is your favorite, like the one you absolutely adore and want to put at the forefront? And secondly, as for soundtrack, what would you say 365 Infantry soundtrack will primarily consist of?" And those core points genuinely are a great way of explaining what this all is and what went into the creation, the conceptualization of 365 Infantry. And I think I'll start with why Wolves. Because why Wolves gets into that vice, not vice kind of mindset of you know it when you see it, and when you see it, it all feels right. And this is going to touch on a lot of those other things about the characters, about the music that I hear whenever I think about this series. I've already mentioned the heavy metal at the outset, so that's already a given, but we'll get more into that later. But why Wolves? I think it goes back to that vice, not vice mindset of something that just came together, clicked, worked, and you just couldn't get it out of your head. And moreover, in the sense that it feels perfectly within the overall image, the countenance of the project. The intellectual, philosophical reason for the wolf is that I kind of see the animal as a great analogy for man in the natural world. Equal parts nobility, savagery, equal parts beauty and violence. there are many layers to the wolf as an image, and I think that not just that, but also the fact that because it is a canine in nature, there is of course that idea of tying it back to the domestic dog, man's best friend. So there is sort of this. I feel the wolf is a very good example of an animal that you can approach with the idea of anthropomorphism. But also, the wolf as an image slots in so seamlessly with the cyberpunk, with the heavy metal imagery, with the Western imagery, with the noir imagery, with the post-apocalyptic imagery. There is something about seeing a wolf. Let's make it plain vanilla gray wolf in a leather jacket, jeans, harness boots, riding a Harley, driving a Mustang, rocking aviators, blasting some fucking Elvis, or blasting some Metallica, or blasting whatever rock group you want to chuck in there. There's something about that confluence, that combination of images and sounds that is like crack to me. I'm addicted. I'm hooked. You can't tell me to stop making the series once the alchemy came together and that mental image gets burned in my mind. You cannot stop me for love nor money from making this series. And I think this was also a preoccupation that goes back to high school. I grew up in a family that mostly had dogs. So there was always kind of this preference, if it was cats or dogs, I don't mind both. But, obviously there's a lot more dogs that I had in my life than cats. But that said, I also grew up I was one of those kids who just loved everything mechanical. I loved boats, I loved trains, I loved automobiles, I loved planes, I loved it all. And I loved going to classic car shows. And I also grew up listening to a lot of classic rock radio stations. We had about two major local stations that were playing classic rock. And so I'm growing up listening to Lynyrd Skynyrd, listening to AC/DC, listening to a lot of veteran acts from late 60s going into the 70s and 80s. I'm now terrified to know that 90s is officially considered classic. I'm now terrified to know that the 2000s are getting their own Sirius XM stations. I am terrified by the passage of time, but let's go back into the past and escape from that for a while. But in all seriousness, so I have a bunch of these baseline things that have been with me growing up all throughout my life. And I think some of it's literally just that juvenile idea of putting all the things that you think are awesome, putting them together, and then you get something you really just enjoy, playing around with and experiencing. In my case, the idea of combining classic cars and canines of some kind, that was something that was kicking around a lot in high school, and I was trying to find the way to make that mesh. And it wasn't until roundabout, I'd say probably in midway through college into 2021, that I really picked up the pen and started seriously considering 365 infantry as a concept. I'd come up with ideas before. In 2017, I had an idea called Renegade Riders, which was basically a layup for what 365 infantry would be, but informed by a lot of things I'd recently been watching. One of them was the old BBC film Threads, which presents itself as this semi-documentary film about, what would happen if nuclear blast hit Sheffield in the UK, a big industrial hub in England. And anyone who's watched Threads knows it's a terrifying watch. It's bleak. It is brutal. But that image of the bombed out United Kingdom turned desolate in a way we only ever see in, whenever we think about, whenever we think about doing post-apocalypse films, we always think about Mad Max, which means we're always thinking about Australia, the Australian outback, or we're always thinking about the desert. And in all fairness, 365 Infantry takes place in the American Southwest. It is basically, Haven is basically where Phoenix, Arizona once sat. That's the general idea of it. But the image of some of the shots, some of the really desolate, creepy shots from Threads, like there's that great moment where someone is crossing is crossing a hill, and you see, I believe it's a she. You see her in silhouette against this very gloomy, overcast sky. And it's dripping with atmosphere. It's like the Danse Macabre from Seventh Seal, where you got everyone dancing in that ring, on the hillside. And you're just taken aback by it. And that mental image is what made me think, hey, let's do something crazy and make a post-apocalypse desert out of the United Kingdom. It doesn't make any sense, meteorologically speaking. It doesn't make any sense given the whole setup of the island, but it's an idea. And so I toyed around with it for a bit. But that, I ultimately fell away from that. I got focused on other things. One of them was a project I've mentioned previously on this, if not by name, but that's Gunning, which was the project I was making all those DVDs for, that I mentioned way back in episode 3, which was scratching the itch and was making me, it was getting the whole canine car thing out of my system, more or less, but with a very specific niche eye towards late 70s, early 80s America, specifically the San Fernando Valley. And there was also a bit more of this magical realism, low fantasy idea behind the series, where all the cars are inexplicably sentient and are these mirrors of the mindset of the drivers. But that, I ultimately kind of burned myself out on the concept. Not that I've ever forgotten it, but that putting so much effort into something that I wasn't yet ready to share publicly, that was kind of when I'm like, okay, we're backburning this. We're going to try the more genre-focused idea. But why wolves, at the end of the day, is just, it fits. You look at the image. You look at this synthesis of ideas that really no one does. This is always... I understand that this series definitely will have appeal for furries, and I honestly welcome anyone. So long as you're a decent, chill person, all are welcome. Leave the baggage at the door. If you come in, you come into the Discord. If you come into... if you reach out to me personally, so long as you're chill, all's copacetic. But there's a reason why I've never really considered 365 Infantry furry. It uses anthropomorphism, it uses that as a literary device, but I don't consider it furry. Because my conception has always been with the idea of furries and the furry community, but also furry art and entertainment, is that it's either super contemporary, like it's very slice of life, very modern day, or it's all high fantasy, like it's all inspired by Redwall or Watership Down, stuff like that. So when I come in to do this exact kind of project, and I'm doing it with this very specific idea of, okay, this is cyberpunk, this is post-apocalypse, but this isn't your synthwave cyberpunk, this isn't your doom and gloom, hopeless despair idea of the post-apocalypse, but it also isn't the uber insanity of Mad Max or latter-day Mad Max. My main inspiration on that front has always been the original 1979 film. And to a lesser extent, but still pretty strong in influence, the second film, Road Warrior. The two in particular, those first two I like because they have a sort of cap on the level of derangedness there is. It's still insane. It's called Mad Max for a reason. There is still a level of madness to the whole experience. but it isn't the cartoon comic book totally over the top and we have the budget for it too version you'd wind up seeing in Beyond Thunderdome and then in this recent wave of films with Fury Road and Furiosa. So you have that going in there. You have the cyberpunk that's pulled more from the Blade Runner future noir idea than, you know, the modern retro 80s revival sort of approach to it that you see in stuff like Cyberpunk 2077. Although that does still play a little more contemporaneously than just being, hey, we're the 80s rehashed. But I'm having all of that on top of this very, very specific idea of Americana, where there's this Western lawman angle, where you got a lot of guys, you know, walking around with old school revolvers. My lead character in the war, Gibson, has two cult single action army, if I got that correct, Mazel, two twin Colt peacemakers on his hips, and the general rocks literally the Dirty Harry gun, the Smith & Wesson Model 27. So a lot of old Western revolvers, or Western-styled revolvers. You got everyone walking around with the denim jackets and the jeans and the cowboy boots, pointed toe supremacy for the win. You got everyone doing that, wearing the bullet belts, wearing the leather jackets. It's this very specific brand of... And obviously, that also became a look adopted by metalheads, rockabillys worldwide. I mean, you go to the new wave of British heavy metal over in the UK, late 70s, early 80s. Everyone's wearing bullet belts. Everyone's wearing leather jackets. You look at the Ramones, punk out of the cities, punk out of New York. Everyone's wearing their leather jackets, all that good stuff. Got the Chuck Taylors on. Awesome. It's a very specific vision that I don't see anywhere else in furry, anthro, whatever you want to call it. I don't see it anywhere else because it's not coming from that mindset. It's not like, oh, I'm making this furry thing. It's, I wanted to tell this series with wolves, with all this heavy metal, Western, noir imagery, and I wanted to combine it all into this sort of singular image that is unlike anything else out there. And I think I've succeeded at that. Because every time someone, I'll have people who come up to me and say, I don't fully understand why wolves, but I can't see it without wolves. This series is meant to star these bipedal wolves. So, at the end of the day, why wolves is just that it fits within the sort of Western image, the sort of neo-Western heavy metal image of the series. But on top of that, I think the wolf really is a very strong, a good analogy for man in the natural world. Because there are layers to the character. There are layers to the idea of the wolf. In this sort of this... I think it was Ray Bradbury who kind of summed up the duality of man best, in that it was, we'll go on killing each other, braining each other, but we'll be beautiful. We'll go on doing all these bad things, but we'll also be doing incredible good. And you just have to get used to the fact that that is the state of man. There are these two... They're not irreconcilable because they both exist. And you have to contend with the fact that both exist at the same time. And I think the wolf is a good animal to play that out with, in that you can have this very vicious fighting and these very violent scenes, but at the same time there are a lot of families in this series. There are a lot of loving couples in this series. There are a lot of really tender, warm-hearted moments, as much as there is classic like grindhouse carnage or some raunchier moments here and there. There's sort of this... There's something for everyone in 365 Infantry at the end of the day. There really is. To go into specifically the big three, because I mentioned one, but I've always had a big three whenever I talk about this series. And that is Blade Runner, Mad Max, and heavy metal. And as I like to say, heavy metal, magazine, movie, music, and all. So let's talk about those big three. I'd mentioned Blade Runner in the cyberpunk bit, and I'd mentioned Mad Max, but let's talk about all three of these a bit more in depth, because each of them in this trifecta contributes something very important to the series. Let's start with Blade Runner, because I often get so lost when I talk about sort of the Mad Max side of things, the desert, the crazy car culture and motorcycles and all that fun stuff, that I do tend to neglect the fact that half of this series is spent in this giant cyberpunk metropolis. And Blade Runner pretty much informs the vast majority of how I conceive of Haven. I've always described Haven as having these cobalt blue nights, these very richly colored evenings, that, as well as, because it's a retro future series, because I write this series as if it's the year 1985, I went up to some publishing house, said, hey, I got this idea, could we do a magazine of it? They say yes, and so off I go, creating this unique world and this unique set of characters. But Blade Runner really has proven the model that I've based my ideas of Haven, my ideas of evenings in Haven, my ideas of the image of this giant city, and how everything... Because the thing about Los Angeles in Blade Runner, and of course many people have pointed to how it sort of anticipates the crowded nature of a lot of cities in like Southeast Asia. And of course, there's, a lot of people, whenever they start talking cyberpunk, they get into this sort of trans-Pacific idea of, pulling in imagery from Japan, ideas, you'll hear Tokyo thrown around in half of everyone's favorite vaporwave or synthwave albums. But with Blade Runner, Haven is not nearly as crowded as Blade Runner, because the idea is that initially it is this post-scarcity society where we have abolished hunger, poverty, no one's on the streets anymore, there is no need to go out and, wantonly commit crime, you have everything you need taken care of. And so it isn't nearly as down and dirty, there isn't that class-based system you saw in Blade Runner, where you have, the Eldon Tyrells of the world in these big palatial apartments, high up above all the detritus. And then you have people down, like the J.F. Sebastians, in these crowded, cramped, old complexes. And you have, I believe the term is kipple, stuffed in drawers from the original PKD book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? So you have all of that going on. But with Blade Runner particularly, it is really that aesthetic image of blue nights and these... there's a lot of Sid Mead in the sense that there's a lot of these very placid, these very smooth, glassy sort of buildings, sort of vehicles. The hover cars in the city of Haven were actually based off of, if memory serves, the Lancia Stratos Zero, which was a concept car that many will remember as playing Michael Jackson in Moonwalker. The bit in the Smooth Criminal featurette that takes up the last 40 minutes or so of Moonwalker, where Michael Jackson, amongst other things, turns into a literal supercar and a fucking robot, which then turns into a spaceship. Anyway, but those flowing lines and that very smooth idea, the smooth surfaces that I really do find a lot in, the work of greats like Sid Mead, that really has been an influence on my conception of Haven. But the other thing about Blade Runner 2 is that its brand of cyberpunk is rooted in classic film noir of the 40s and 50s. And that older influence does come up a lot in my dialogue. I am very much a hard-boiled writer. That's how I see a lot of the way I approach my dialogue. And I study the guys who did it best. Billy Wilder and a lot of his noir scripts, obviously Double Indemnity being the crown jewel. There are lines in that script that are fresh as the day they were penned. And of course, it took him tag teaming it with Raymond Chandler to take another legend, James M. Cain's book, and just bring it to a whole nother level on the silver screen. But it's not just that, but it's also lines like... I put a lot of stock into Philip Yordan. I know he's a very controversial man when you look into his history with Hollywood and everything, accusations of, ghostwriters and stuff like that. But there are lines in The Big Combo that are just so fucking good. We're gonna fix it so you don't hear the bullets. Oh my god, I fucking love The Big Combo as far as scripting goes. It's a very well done piece. And there's a lot from that particular era of Hollywood, but film noir from that era with so much sly wordplay and these double entendres and the innuendo and the implications, that is quintessentially great dialogue. For those who are playing at home, we've mentioned Threads, Mad Max, Road Warrior, Blade Runner, Double Indemnity, The Big Combo. What else am I about to add to your movie watching list? Hang on, it's gonna get worse as this episode drags on. But to bring it back to Blade Runner, I will also say this. Whenever I need to get in the mood to write for Haven, the music that immediately makes me think about all those beautiful silver autocops floating through the city skyline, the glassy palatial apartments, the neon tube lighting that I remember initially coming up with that side tangent when I was writing a story, Stats on the Rocks, back in 2022, which, to show you the depths of obscurity I'm willing to go with this series, opens with a reference to Color Teenies, which, for those playing at home, was something Tom Snyder, broadcasting legend and host of The Tomorrow Show and the original host of The Late Late Show, would often describe as the drink you have while watching television. Yeah, that's how deep in I get with this series sometimes. I will reference whatever the hell I want, or pull in whatever allusions I want to make the points that I want to make. But to roll it back in, whenever I need to get into that neon mindset, or I need to get back into that cobalt blue mist of Haven's evening, there's only one soundtrack I put on, and that is Vangelis's Blade Runner soundtrack. Everything about that record, about everything he put into the film, is just what I hear. It's either that or I'm listening to like dream punk, like I'm listening to 2814. Literally, it's one of the two. But in particular, Vangelis's Blade Runner soundtrack, whenever there are two tracks that'll take me right into my workflow whenever I'm working on this series. Writing, giving feedback, conceptualizing, two tracks. One of them is a library track from a UK production music label, Bruton. Telecom by James Asher, which takes me right into the desert whenever I need to go there. The climbing arpeggios, the thumping basses, the expansive synth pads. That is the sound of me journeying into the wastelands. If the sun's either rising or the sun's setting, but either way, it's there at magic hour, and I'm there, I'm gone. But when conceptualizing Haven, all 8 minutes of Blade Runner blues takes me there in a heartbeat. Particularly that, too, because that's probably the quintessential example of this noir approach to cyberpunk, this specific future noir idea. Because the way he approaches it with these long, mellow synth pads and that haunting sort of synth trumpet, quasi, whatever you want to call it. And he's just riffing, he's just vamping, playing off the chords, taking you deeper in those rolling, whooshing sort of synth sounds. Ay, it is. I'm hearing it now. I can't play it because I'll get copyright struck, but I'm hearing it now. And it is one of those ephemeral things. You're going to be noticing this a lot through the hour. One of those ephemeral things basically describes how I approach this series in terms of conceptualizing it. There are little touches, little things that just make something come together. And every time I listen to Blade Runner Blues, that's what helps make Haven come together for me. So Blade Runner is my model for cyberpunk, specifically because it comes exactly within that threshold of I created this series in 1985, Blade Runner came out in 82, and even though it wasn't this big box office smash, people were still talking about it at the time, even though it had bombed. And obviously, it wouldn't be until 1992 that we'd get the director's cut based off of that work print. But Blade Runner would still be a known quantity at the time. And of course, it's also my imaginary fictitious scenario, so I can pull on whatever the fuck I want. Why would I even know what Bruton is in the year 1985? Unless I was, some schlub working at an editing bay. Cutting together trailers for major studios, or more likely if you're using library tracks, some small indie studio most likely. But anyway, that's Blade Runner's big influence. It brought the noir, it brought the atmosphere, it brought the sort of unique design ethos that I have pulled into my conception of the city. To move on to Mad Max, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? The car culture aspect, the desert set aspect, obviously Australian outback versus southwestern United States. But the other thing about Mad Max 2, not just Mad Max 2, there's a set of words to stumble across. But the other thing about those first two Mad Max films being inspiration is that, in particularly with the first one, there's such a unique approach to be, well, not even a unique approach, but there's such a character-driven approach in that first picture that really does inform a lot of how I approach writing with the Wastelands. That these are very raw emotions, they're very intimately felt, and that becomes fuel for the action of the stories. When I wrote Children of the Neon Goddess, the winter 2022 story, it's a mindfuck story. So there's a bit of Harlan Ellison in there, there's a bit of Pete K.D. in there, Philip K. Dick. But the strength of emotions, I think, really does go back to that first Mad Max film. The rage, the grief at his family being killed, and of course his weapon, 600 horses of fuel-injected vengeance. That intensity and rawness of emotion really is how everyone in the Wastelands lives it up to 11. Life is cranked up, dials ripped off the fucking speaker system. That is how life is lived in the Wastelands. But at the same time, I specify Mad Max, the first Mad Max, because of that interstitial period it exists within its societal collapse. The fact that there are still institutions there, that things still exist, that there are still people leading relatively normal lives, that it hasn't become the insanity you see in Fury Road, or in Beyond Thunderdome, or in Road Warrior. Road Warrior, obviously, the carnage, the chaos, that's really that's my preferred level of madness when writing for this series. Anything above that kind of turns into, like, Bollywood masala film levels of insane. Which is good in their appointed context. I quite like Beyond Thunderdome, and I'm going to be sitting down and watching Fury Road soon. Whenever I can, find the spare 5 seconds to breathe and watch a movie. But Specifically with that first Mad Max, though, the action is so incredibly tight, it's so incredibly focused, the chases are expertly edited, incredible stunt work being performed there, especially the rocket-launched fucking car in the opening kill with Knight Rider and all that stuff. Good grief. Just such memorable imagery with, you know, the eyes popping out and everything, which is a great little piece of, we'll call it a makeup effect because it's being done with people, but that's besides the point. But it's also the fact that this is all happening on the back of really solid character drama. Like, it's the best revenge film this side of Death Wish. I'll fucking say it. It's the best vigilante picture this side of Death Wish. Hands down. One of the top 10 greatest action films ever made. Because of its smaller scope, because of its smaller scope, you can feel those emotions. You can feel that stuff more intensely. And that's what I want whenever I'm writing for 365. Like when I'm writing something like The Hunt, which is about these very intimately felt emotions, which is about these very real, raw urges, these primordial urges. Because the whole thrust of The Hunt is that these characters have been abducted for some psychological conditioning to unlock these, you know, to essentially unlock the equivalent of the ape brain in man. It's to reduce these bipedal, civilized wolves down to actual animals again. To unlock all those uninhibited, you know, all of the things we suppress. That is what this conditioning is meant to unlock. To create these sort of super soldier type characters. And then have that enhanced and augmented with cybernetics to create these, you know, the perfect killing machine. I admire its purity. Anyway, that sort of idea. So it's a crazy concept, but because these are very intense and very raw emotions, I don't want it to always be, you know, hordes of bikers running across the hills en masse. It's like the Soviet adaptation of War and Peace. There's just thousands of extras running across the hills in mad glee. I need there to be that intimacy to experience those emotions. To have a character like Marcus, who is on this Jekyll and Hyde light switch flip in The Hunt, where if you mess with anyone he considers a friend, a loved one, his wife, you are a dead man. You are a dead man. The moment you cross this wolf, you forfeit your right to breathe. Basically, is how he's approached in those early first 2 years of The Hunt. And you can't do that when everything is so chaotic, so over the top. So I really do prefer the scope of that first Mad Max film. And that also isn't to say that, you know, I'm thumbing my nose at how George Miller approaches things nowadays, but specifically that unique combination of being a low-budget picture with tremendous ambition, which is kind of also the story of this series and the story of a lot of creators who have rallied around the idea of the Iron Age, as coined by guys like Razorfist. This idea of having to, you know, hammer things out, start from the ground up, and make what it is you want to see. And I think that really is one of the other takeaways with Mad Max, is that its B-movie exploitation origins are really kind of, again, like with the whole Walter B. Gibson model of work ethic, like with Harlan Ellison's work ethic, which is insane. The man was a absolute beast on the typewriter. It's the scrappiness, the go get 'em and get it by hook or by crook attitude of that first Mad Max film. And again, to a lot of the Mad Max films, because just because the budget increases doesn't mean there aren't less challenges. No, in fact, the challenges get even more and more insane and exorbitant with each film. But with that first one, It's that perfect level of intimacy and that perfect level of insanity. And if I ever go above that, it's only to Road Warrior levels, where we aren't at, big sprawling scenes and all that fun, big sprawling scenes in the Fury Road sense, but we do have a level of scope and scale. Now, the last of the three, we're going to talk about heavy metal as in the movie heavy metal, although we will naturally be touching on the magazine, its original French version, Metal Hurlant. But the thing about heavy metal, the movie, that specifically has ingrained itself into the DNA of 365 is the idea of variety. That film was the reason why I said, let's do 5 stories every quarter. That's the reason why I'm essentially writing 4 series and an anthology under the umbrella of one project, because I liked that level of variety. And the thing that I really love about Heavy Metal 1981 is not just the level of variety, but the level of talent behind that variety. There are people who were doing designs on that film that I had no idea were doing designs on that film. Like, everyone knows about, Mobius, Long Tomorrow, inspiration behind Harry Canyon. Everyone knows about Richard Corbin's Den. There are all these things, and then I'm seeing names like I believe Enki Bilal, another bande dessinée icon, Juan Jimenez, I believe, has designs in the film. Just so many names where you go looking into production, just design after design after design, and you can tell these are people who had art that was featured in the magazine, whether it was adaptations of stuff from the magazine or some of the original creations, like with Tarna. But that specific approach to variety, and then, of course, the sonic quality. The actual soundtrack is so specific. This will basically answer one of Faye Astra's questions. What is the soundtrack to this particular series? And if you wanted a model for it, it would be the soundtrack to Heavy Metal. Everything from the down-tempo, mellow balladry of stuff like All of You by Don Felder, the genuine classic heavy metal sound of stuff like Mob Rules by Black Sabbath, the strange little foreign asides like Prefabricated by Trust, which is a French metal band, if I'm not mistaken, to the more classic rock styled material, something like Stevie Nicks' Blue Lamp, or the utterly atmospheric Veteran of the Psychic Wars by Blue Oyster Cult. The soundtrack to that film in particular is so specifically tied to this vision of the series. I pull from music from later on. Like, I listen to a lot of late 80s. I listen to a lot of AOR. So there's a lot more reverb. There are a lot more glossy synths and stuff like that. A lot more soul balladeering kind of vocals by guys like Glenn Hughes or Joe Lynn Turner. And some of the softer sides of Graham Bonnet, particularly on Alcatraz, especially because you have albums like Dangerous Games or Disturbing the Peace with Steve Vai, and of course that debut record with Yngwie Malmsteen, No Parole for Rock and Roll, in '83. But the heavy metal soundtrack, with music by Cheap Trick, Devo, Blue Oyster Cult, all these different bands and all these different solo acts. I mean, Don Felder from the Eagles, for crying out loud. That unique synthesis of classic late 70s, early 80s rock and metal, combined with this anything goes approach to fantasy and sci-fi in a way that very few animated productions were doing. There were very few anime films being imported at that time, and we were still years away from formative stuff in cyberpunk like Akira or Ghost in the Shell, or any of the OVAs like Bubblegum Crisis. We were years away from... Well, actually, the nice thing about when heavy metal came out is that we were in a sort of a weird period between the heights of Disney, where you had, after Walt died, there was this sort of... Films were still popular, they still made money, except for Black Cauldron, but there was a clear devaluing of Disney stock in the public eye that was finally restored with Little Mermaid in '89. So during that period, you get guys like Ralph Bakshi coming in, making films like Wizards, like Lord of the Rings, like Fire and Ice. You have heavy metal, which is a Canadian special, I shall say, because I'm still utterly bewildered by the fact that it was produced by Ivan Reitman, and half the cast of SCTV are voice actors on heavy metal, so you have a bit of a humorful bent to the stories. So beautiful, so dangerous, and stuff like that. But at the same time, there's still some very serious approaches to classic genre entertainment, namely Tarna, with this whole science fantasy look and feel, as well as the linking device of the Lochnar, this sort of this embodiment of all evil throughout the universe. But it's that variety hour approach, which I always liken now when I'm talking about the series to Hanna-Barbera's Power Hour style of cartoon programming, where you'd have a bunch of characters occupying a half hour or a full hour of show, and you get this sort of this... You basically get a variety hour, like back in ye olden days of early television. You get basically this variety hour, but now with these action-adventure cartoons. I liken it to that more because of the old pulp influences, but really, the semi-anthology approach was started by heavy metal, and by the sheer volume and level of imagination that went into that film. I had also started collecting issues of Heavy Metal magazine at the time, and I'm kind of astonished and a little miffed at myself for not really reading them, because it only was until a few years ago that I started opening these magazines up and realizing just who was in them. In the very first story we ever published, Obsidian Army, originally Night Falls on Terror's Reign, these tall, Gort-like androids, called the Black Androids, were inspired by a René Laloux film. Now, for those who don't know, René Laloux is a French animator. Most will know him for 1973's Fantastic Planet. It's the weird, Czech animated French film with the giant blue people and humans for pets. Do with that context as you will. But it was inspired by, I believe it was his last feature-length, Gandahar. Yeah, I believe Gandahar was his last feature-length film. And the Metal Men, I believe they're called, were designed by Philippe Caza. And I didn't realize a bunch of those magazines did have the work of Caza in them. So I'm now all of a sudden looking at these being like, oh my god, it's Caza. Oh my god, it's Enki Bilal. Oh my god, it's a Harlan Ellison story. What the fuck? You know, I had stuff I didn't even know were in these magazines. And that's just the sheer garden variety of this style of anthology magazine. I started collecting anthology, these kinds of magazines because of heavy metal. The digest-sized ones, like fantasy and science fiction, analog, stuff like that. But the art of heavy metal magazine, the sheer, the spaciness, there's a lot of organic looking stuff. I remember, oh my gosh, there are covers. And part of this is because, of course, National Lampoon, when they were bringing it over stateside, were hamming up the adult side of, the adult illustrated fantasy magazine. And so you got a lot more risque covers in general. But there are some, depictions of like aliens and stuff like that that just get the mind going. And while it doesn't have anything to do with the terrestrial nature of 365 infantry, and in all fairness, we're a bit chaste about the adult content in that regard. I don't really do gratuity for gratuity's sake. There is violence, there is sex in 365 infantry. The joke I crack with people is I wouldn't go any lower than 16. Although your parents would be a hell of a lot more disappointed in you if they found a copy of Hustler rather than if they found a copy of 365 infantry. If anything, the wolves will throw them off the trail. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But in all seriousness, I don't go anywhere near the kind of stuff Heavy Metal Magazine does in terms of adult content, but the sheer creativity of it and the willingness to go that far in a way Western comics, by and large, were not at that time. They were not pushing that content boundary the way the French were, or the way anime was. Or, well, manga, I should say, my mistake. But the way either Japan or France were really pushing boundaries artistically in the medium of comics. That was not happening stateside nearly to this degree. And that's the big reason why Heavy Metal, the magazine, also inspired so much of 365 infantry. It is that daring to dream, to go that one step beyond, that the film exhibits, that the magazine exhibits, and that really is one of the big inspirations behind the Variety Hour approach, the Power Hour approach to the series, and our approach to being a mature project. I could totally neuter this, no pun intended, and turn it into like a Saturday morning cartoon affair. And I might actually do a kid-friendly version of it one day, because I think it has legs in that field too. Like, I joke about this with people where if I had pitched this as a TMNT knockoff back in the day, I'm sure I could have gotten a toy company like Topps or someone to fucking go gaga for it and say, yes, we'll get you a 13-episode series right away. And just in time for first-run syndication to become popular, so they then order like 52 episodes later, like the insane bulk orders they put on Batman the Animated Series or Gargoyles or what have you. But no, Heavy Metal Magazine and Heavy Metal 1981 are the big reasons why this series adopts the heavy metal look and aesthetic, but also is the heavy metal music look and aesthetic, I should say, the classic metalhead punk style, but also the ambition, the scope, the imaginative qualities, the willingness to think outside the box. Those are the big inspirations behind how I approach this series. And I will also say, we do have some fun nods to it here and there, and I don't think without Heavy Metal I would have written a character as ballistic as Lita from Urban Avenger, who is my beloved hippie punk who runs around with a wieldy hunter on her hip, Charles Bronson's hand cannon from Death Wish 3, running around with that on her hip, driving a fucking hopped up VW Beetle, a 66, palling around in a denim jacket and fucking Birkenstock sandals, and smoking everything that's not nailed down. That is definitely more Heavy Metal the movie. Especially from the So Beautiful, So Dangerous segment where they're snorting lines off the spaceship. That is massive Lita energy, although she does not do the hard stuff. She indulges a little in the cannabis, but she does not do the hard drugs. But that sort of humor and that sort of bizarreness in Urban Avenger, and that's definitely pulled from Heavy Metal the movie, without a doubt. But yeah, so I could go on and on about that in particular, but I do want to go into some of the other more, not so much subtler influences, but perhaps the more undercurrent influences. The big one is Gerry Anderson. And I tell this story all the fucking time, and you're gonna hear it again, whether you like it or not. I tell this story over and over and over again, but when I was in college and I got a day off from one of my classes, I hunkered down, I grabbed my box set of Thunderbirds, and I watched City of Fire for the first time in years. Because I'd seen it on YouTube growing up, but I never really paid much attention to it outside of, oh, cool, the models are blowing up. How awesome. But when I watched it then and there, I was struck by its depiction of courage, its depiction of bravery. The series writer, one of the regulars for the Andersons at that point, Alan Fennell, wrote an incredible example of this, where you have this family trapped in the basement of this burning mega skyscraper. They manage to evacuate everyone else except this family trapped in the bulkhead system. And the only way to get to them is use this very experimental form of gas. A very experimental form of welding gas to cut through the walls. The problem is, though, it actually manages to go through the protective suits, and essentially, prolonged exposure with this tank on your back will lead to passing out, and potentially, it goes directly to your bloodstream, basically. It will lead to death after prolonged exposure. But even with those stakes raised insanely high for Scott and Virgil Tracy of International Rescue, even if, by all of the metrics, even if the family perished, it would still be a resounding success of a rescue. Those two guys go down there and cut through wall after wall with a gas that could kill them just to save that one family. That is... It sounds like I'm insane for pulling this as a great example, because oh, it's Thunderbirds, it's the one with the puppets and the stuff. That should be studied in storytelling classes. It is left that big of an impression on me. It is such a wonderful, powerful example of heroism in a way you don't see in a lot of modern entertainment. I learn more from a 60-year-old puppet show than I can learn from going to the fucking theater. Tell me how that squares. Tell me how the fuck that's supposed to square. But it's not just Thunderbirds that really influenced the series. I discussed in the past how Captain Scarlet, the tone of Captain Scarlet, the character of Colonel White, influenced the creation of General Knox. General Knox being the leader of the 365th Infantry and one of the main characters in the war, who originally was conceived of as this Clint Eastwood, cat's eye, kind of type. And obviously the Smith & Wesson Model 27 being a reference to Dirty Harry to seal the deal. But as Knox grows, he grows into that stoic composure of Colonel White. And when I wrote down his declaration of Red Alert in the story Ride the Black Country, which in and of itself, for those who don't know, is actually a nod to a old Sam Peckinpah film, Ride the High Country, but I digress. That declaration of Red Alert, I was hearing in the voice of Colonel White from Captain Scarlet. That driving, commanding sort of presence that you need. And of course, the difference is that he has it amped up with that sort of Patton-esque energy. Sort of my Americanization of this very English, very British sort of authority figure. But also, not just that, I'd say generally the idea of levity in these programs. There's a very jolly sort of sense about so many of the episodes in an Anderson show. And obviously that's because initially being puppet-based and all that, there's very much a juvenile... the target demographic is juveniles. So you have shows like Supercard, Fireball XL5 that feel like a comic book half-hour show. Feel literally ripped right out of a Gold Key comic. Simple plots, straightforward, get in, get out. Here are the stakes, here's the problem, here's the solution, have a wonderful time in between. But then once they expanded and they did something like Thunderbirds that enhanced the need and intent, not just the need necessarily, but showed improvement, vast improvement in the roster of writers they curated to tell these stories and to grant these more in-depth characters that depth, and which then leads to something like a Captain Scarlet, which is frankly a drama that's mature enough that adults can appreciate. I watched Captain Scarlet, and I do not feel like I'm watching a kid's show. Not just because of, the whole thrust of it's that, these mysterious aliens from Mars, these invisible creatures, have to kill people to recreate them and enact their vengeance upon mankind. Yes, there's that. But there's always been a level of maturity in older fiction that's been enjoyed by young audiences. Like with Edgar Rice Burroughs. There's a lot of really grown-up stuff in the Tarzan novels and in John Carter of Mars, Princess of Mars, Chessmen and all that. There's a lot of mature stuff in that, but that innate sense of adventure, that innate sense of escapism is universal. Anyone from any age can enjoy it. It's that classic, from 9 to 90, anyone can enjoy this. And that's what I really love about those Anderson shows. The Supermarionation stuff, the live-action series like UFO and Space 1999, although both are obviously more pitched at an adult primetime audience. But there is that innate sense of universality and being able to reach people on a pure like emotional basis. Like, to talk diversity for 5 seconds, Captain Scarlet is probably better than anything made in the past 20 years as far as diversity is concerned, because it does not draw attention to it. You have the Angels, the female fighter pilots. You have Lieutenant Green, who is, I believe, Cy Grant was Guyanese, I think, off the top of my head. But essentially, he was a black Britishman. And there's no attention drawn to any of it. It's just they're there to do a job. They're there to protect the world. They're damn good at it, even in the face of this incredibly canny enemy. But it's this team working together for a common goal, and they just get on with their business. That's one of the nicer things about using wolves, actually. Another answer to the question of why wolves is because I think it's a better analogy and a better allegory to, people, to divisions of like race and gender and so on. Because it's all the same species. It's like, as cornball as it often sounds, it's like, the only race I'm a part of is the human race. As corny as the saying goes, I think the value of using a single species within that context makes it make more sense, because you're showcasing innate differences between people, but you're showcasing them in the same form. We're not looking at it as, a fox and a rabbit or something like that. We're looking at it as, a fox and a fox. There's a level of honest comparison as opposed to constant contrast. And I think and the thing also is, this is all stuff I never touch in the series. I have never made this an issue. There have been insults thrown around that if you're reading with it in mind, you can kind of hear how it's creating that venom without actually, throwing around slurs and random shit. Like in the case of Speed Freak Files, there's actually a joke at the end of one of the most recent stories, the most recent actually, 2 to Tango, 4 to Shred, where the latest member of the speed metal band Metropolis is having a bunch of Indian jokes made of him, Native American, I should say. And he's like, "You're not going to stop making these, are you?" It's like, buddy, we've called each other worse. And the worst I ever get in an actual story on screen, so to speak, is, Richter Garrett, the youngest of the trio, calling Nick a black son of a bitch or something like that. Nothing really out there. But that's sort of the key thing. I really do not draw attention to those divisions. And I consider Captain Scarlet to be the model example of being able to do this. It is so easy to make that whole idea of diversity work. There is so much coding in 365. There are characters there are Latin American characters. There are characters who are implied to be analogous to Black Americans. There are characters analogous to be white Americans, characters analogous to be Asian Americans. And some of them I don't have to be, some of it's as simple as the last name. I wrote a flash story, The Sabbath of J.F. Kwan. JF being a nod to J.F. Sebastian from Blade Runner, but also Kwan being the hint that this is someone of Asiatic extraction. But at the same time, it's just more to create a sense of color, a sense of flavor, it sets a preconception for how you perceive the character, but not in terms of it's being written in a stereotype or anything way, but that it adds background. It adds a level of depth that if you're reading with that depth in mind, you're like, oh, this is how the world's filled out. Oh, these are some of the cultural things that are going on here. And again, Captain Scarlet is such a great example of this because it is so easy to just do, this. It's there. You don't acknowledge it, but it's there. And yet I see so many people physically incapable of doing that in the modern day. And it's frankly annoying. It's like fumbling it at the goal line, really. But also, after a certain point, some people are doing this to actually increase division. Some people are doing this because they're too stupid. It is what it is. And more importantly, I don't make an issue of it because the people I learn from don't make an issue of it in the way that I prefer. I prefer it to be. But also, to go back to Gerry Anderson in particular, his those earlier shows, actually, Supercar, Fireball XL5, really are the backbone, and Stingray, actually, that first trio of properly Supermarionation series, as he coined them, with the sophisticated puppetry and the elaborate miniature effects. Those first three series in that run, before Thunderbirds, are basically the bedrock upon which the audio show Alan FIREDALE is founded. It's that with Jonny Quest and Knight Rider in the mix. Alan FIREDALE, of course, being this, wholesome little half-hour romp of this young rebellious Red Wolf and his AI-enhanced DeSoto Fireflight, who's this, lovable little character. I'll be honest, writing and performing Alan FIREDALE is almost a form of therapy at this point, because I do it all with like a smile on my face when I'm not screaming at fucking up the lines. I really have so much fun recording that show because it's such a sweet, such a genuine little... Because it's meant to be a work of in-world fiction. It's meant to be a radio show listened to by Wastelanders in the world of 365 Infantry, created by a denizen by the name of Stan Winshaw, who, like myself, is performing it as a one-man audiobook with supplementary music and sound effects and all that fun stuff. But Alan FIREDALE, conceptually, is this combination of the old Anderson format of, you got these strange dilemmas, you got to come out, you got to solve, with the setup of Knight Rider, the AI enhanced car, and of course running around solving mysteries and righting wrongs in the tradition of classic American adventure television from the time. I mean, Knight Rider is one of the best examples of the formula in my opinion, but it's not the only one. You have shows like The Incredible Hulk from back in the day and stuff like that. But then the key to it all is the nonchalance of a show like Jonny Quest. It is hard. It is so hard for me to explain the wire act you have to walk to create nonchalance in a series like Alan FIREDALE, based on series like Jonny Quest, and those comic strip shows of old, like what Cambria Productions was doing with Space Angel. which featured designs by Alex Toth, Doug Wildey. Wildey, of course, going on to do Jonny Quest, and Toth famously going on to do Space Ghost, also at Hanna-Barbera, as part of that, again, Power Hour variety show, where they're doing 2 shots of Space Ghost, and in the middle, sandwiched between, is Dino Boy in the Lost Valley, a classic Lost World style setup with Tim Matheson, original voice of Jonny Quest, coming in for that show. But there is a special level of relinquishing your inhibition you have to reach to do something like what Jonny Quest does. Jonny Quest will present positively bizarre concepts with utter, not blasé in the sense that, oh, I seen that yesterday, but in that you're able to face this problem with confidence and then laugh it off like it was nothing. There's a level of power fantasy in there, and that is something quite recently has finally clicked into place with Alan FIREDALE. I did an episode, Cosmic Conflagration, for our summer issue in this year, and it's a UFO story. It's an alien invasion story. Just one alien, one spaceship, and the tone of that show, man, I never thought I'd be able to do that, because I listened to that episode, and you have this insanity. I'm introducing aliens to the world of Alan FIREDALE. And there is you don't know until the very end, but there's a 99% chance this could be real. Obviously, all odds say, what, there never be aliens on Earth, classic naysaying, stuff like that. And that's what one of the guest character, Dr. Vern, is dealing with, is constant skepticism about, is this alien, or is this some invention of wolfkind, the big bad villain out in the city of San Cipre. But the wire act of that show, where we are selling, there's danger, there's jeopardy, this thing is a very serious threat, and then we're able to let it go at the end of the show. The problem's over, the day's been saved, and we move on as if almost nothing happened. You have to have a supreme level of confidence to do that in the modern age. And you have to have a very honest, you have to do this with utmost sincerity. My greatest accomplishment going to my grave will be that I made a show like Alan FIREDALE and I played it 100% straight, even if it can be interpreted as camp. It's not deliberately campy. We're not winking. We're not nodding. We are just being honest, unashamed, classic comic strip adventure like Jonny Quest. Jonny Quest is that model. It is the gold standard for that, because it's this wonderful cast you get to play off with. Dr. Benton Quest, Race Bannon, Johnny, Haji, this wonderful quartet that's always bouncing off of each other, always quick with quips, always quick with a sense of camaraderie, always with clear dynamics. Benton Quest is the father to Johnny and also the adoptive father to Haji. Race Bannon is defending them, with life and limb, but is also this really cool, great friend to have around. Not just for the protection, but just because he's a really fun guy to be around. And then, of course, there's, the innocence, but also the ingenuity and thoughtfulness of Johnny and Haji. And then playing off of each other with two different worldviews. Especially with Haji and his, unique, borderline magical abilities, for lack of better words. And the fact that you're able to have this already bizarre, and people have parodied this. This was the basis of Venture Brothers on Adult Swim. Is what would it be like if a boy adventurer like Johnny grew up? That was the original thrust of Venture Brothers. So this is a concept that's been parodied, that's been done to death, but to be able to capture that innocence, that honest, unashamed, we're going to tell you some crazy stories, but it's going to be all right at the end of the half hour. Everything's going to be all right, kids. That level of supreme confidence, it takes an army in Hollywood, but fortunately all it took was me, my audio man, Brendan, and a lot of studying from the likes of Jonny Quest, and also the likes of classic era Doctor Who. I think about Jon Pertwee's third Doctor, who is also the basis of a character in the series, Professor Smith from Urban Avenger, who is this genuine, old-school caped crusader, but with a little more teeth on him. He carries, a nice revolver, he's good with a sword, and he drives around in an E-type Jaguar. But when Pertwee was describing his choice of actually wearing a cloak, a cape, he had described it as the wings of the mother hen, over her children. The idea that even though things would get scary, even though things would get intense, that the Doctor was here and he'd make things right in the end. And that carries that series so much, because there are some very, very, especially in that very first season he did, where it's very much inspired by Quatermass, the Quatermass serials and the Quatermass character by Nigel Neal. And you get shows like Inferno, which get grim. Inferno is one of the best pieces of science fiction put to television, but it's also a very dark serial, and I love that about that era of Doctor Who, that willingness to go in those directions, while also later livening things up and becoming more of that classic science fantasy experience. But Pertwee's Doctor, this man-of-action persona, being stone-faced, in the face of these strange cosmic evils and these bizarre alien entities and this peculiar phenomena, and then putting it right in the end, is very key to not just Alan Firedale, and not just the character of Professor Smith. That level of reassurance, that level of purity is still in the character, even though he gets his hands a little dirtier than Pertwee's Doctor. But that sense of we're going to make things right, we're going to take care of the problem, really is one of my great guiding lights in the creation of this series. In all of the stories. Because even though there is a bit more of a grindhouse bent, it's a little more vulgar here, there, and everywhere. Lita is this, dope-smoking hippie punk. Nick Ridgefield is this metalhead lawman who will dispatch his villains of the week in particularly gruesome fashions. There's a lot of serious drama going on in The Hunt and in The War. To go back to Children of the Neon Goddess and that whole mindfuck story, that was the creation of this surrogate father-son relationship between Gibson and Knox, both supplementing things they had lost to Haven, to Aces, the villain. Knox, in his case, General Knox, lost his arm as a Haven police officer in a freak accident. Note the air quotes I'm verbalizing. And also lost his wife, who he met after escaping, in the biggest battle he led during his time as general, the Centurion Offensive, where basically she stares the enemy into the whites of their non-existent eyes and deals a death blow, and sacrifices herself in the process. He has a lot that's been taken from him. Part of his humanity, for lack of a better phrase, the love of his life, and the chance to have had children with her, to have built a family with her. And so Gibson, who was also an escapee of Haven, and essentially had lost friends to Aces spiraling out of control, loses his family to the mind wash, to the brain rot of always being jacked into the system, always being, part of, never question the state, never question, what they tell you. And there's a great moment in one of the Tales from the Frontline stories, which is the anthology side of the magazine, where I don't name him, But Gibson was interviewed by whitecoats, who are the lab assistants that tend to aces and make sure that all the servers are still running, to make sure that the core operating system is still functioning, who tells them that during the period where she immediately becomes sentient and immediately becomes and immediately improves everything like 200%. She makes the city that's already really great to live in unbelievably fantastic. There's this great little moment where where an unnamed Gibson is being interviewed, and he says, "We had a supreme pizza on our meal itinerary for dinner, because in this world there are synthesizers that basically make the food instantly. It's all based on molecular samples that are collected, added into this database, and they just make the food wholesale. It's like in Star Trek. They just make the food from out of the molecular components. It's a sci-fi gobbledygook. And they all take a bite out of this pizza, and because Aces is now firing on like all the cylinders, it's so good everyone just immediately eyes water in the majesty of this incredibly well done supreme pizza. I have a good head of humor when I talk about this series, because there are things that I am writing to be genuinely comical. That was one of those weird little moments that I'm like, the best part of living in Haven, the pizza's fantastic, yo. Eat your heart out, Chicago. Eat your heart out, New York. We got Haven pizza, baby. So to bring it on back, he escapes from wonderfully made pizza and state propaganda is what Gibson escapes from. But in all seriousness, he loses, like with Knox, he loses friends to freak accidents. Those who even dare question the state have the absolute, the might of Zeus called down upon them. And that story, Children of the Neon Goddess, is those two kind of coming together over those shared losses, and kind of facing the call, the siren song of Aces, wanting all who she felt were worthy of her love, of her devotion, and wanting those children back. And of course, after you killed a man's wife, you killed people's friends. You're not exactly winning them over. This isn't a winning strategy, even with the brainwashing going on. The whole idea of any of these series is that there are heroes that are there to put things right no matter what. That no matter the temptations, the struggles, both within and outside, they are going to make it all work in the end. There's a can-do attitude. There's a justice will prevail attitude. And it goes right back to that pulp influence. It goes right back to Walter B. Gibson's The Shadow, this dark angel of justice. It goes back to a Lester Dent's Doc Savage, this very hopeful, optimistic adventure style of series. That is also in the DNA of 365 Infantry. And the Lester Dent master formula is what people should be studying to become really good at not just writing short fiction, but writing fiction in general. The ability to keep swatting your hero with a fistful of trouble, hammering them every 1,500 words, and, building and building until the problem seems insurmountable, but then they find the right solution, and they make it all turn around in their favor in the end. That's what makes characters like John Pertwee's Doctor. That's what makes shows like Johnny Quest and the works of Gerry and Sylvia Anderson, like Thunderbirds. That's what makes those shows so important to this series. There is a genuine... while it's not always a Britishness, per se, there is a great deal of influence from classic British television on this project, without a doubt. I think I'll round this out by answering the last question, which is, who is your favorite character? Like the one you really want at the forefront of this series. The top dog Pun aggressively intended. And it's a tough question because as the old saying goes, it is like choosing your children. Because I conceive this series as the smaller narratives are part of a greater whole. You can't have Speed Freak Files without the war. You can't have Urban Avenger without the hunt. Even if some of these don't directly cross over with each other yet. Everyone has a part to play in this fight for freedom. It's very much an all hands on deck sort of setup. And that was right from the word go. The name itself, 365 Infantry, is not just oh, I thought it was catchy, but it's this idea of this all day, everyday fight, and something that also has in-world meaning. Because the character of General Knox actually renamed the Resistance Force from the Amburyxian Ascensors, which was its original name, a combination of the Latin word for riders, kind of an idea of the Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, versus, and affixed to that is Amburyxian, which Ambiorix was one of the Gauls of Belgica, who revolted against Rome. And that was a very, very specific choice because one, I liked the alliteration. One, I liked the name Ambiorix. It's a very striking thing. But the character who named the force that initial name, General Godred, is one of my favorites to write for because he's this history buff who becomes a pivotal leader in this fight for freedom because he is the first general of the infantry. And he is this really insanely knowledgeable guy who starts out as this Western lawman who tries to put together a team to help rebuild society the way it should be in his view, which is the very classically liberal, classic American idea. 1776 will commence again and all that. And his choice of this, the idea of this figure who revolts against as large a force as Rome. He's like, this is as best an analogy as I can find on the books. And I also mention in an article that he is also aware of the fact that Ambiorix just fucked off into the wilderness, never to be seen again. After Rome ultimately did, take care of most of Ambiorix's men, Ambiorix just fucked off, basically. You never heard from him again. There are no records after the big defeat. But he is still considered something of a national hero in I believe it's Belgium. Belgium is where, I'm doing this off the top of my head, and also I've been recording for like 90 plus minutes, bear with me. But long and short of it is, General Godred was fully aware of the entire history of Ambiorix, and he's like, no, I think this is our guy. But then when Knox takes over and then loses his wife to the Centurion Offensive in 2466, he decides to rechristen the force as the 365th Infantry, not just as an all-day testament to the all-day everyday fight, but also because his wife drove a Porsche 356, who, during Restoration, had swapped the numbers around Porsche 365. So there's a dual meaning to that. And I shit you not, when pre-producing the series, because this series went through a phase of pre-production starting in August of 2021 and lasted till about April, when we finally started, we had started writing stories for the first issue in winter of 2021, going into 22. But we started, when we had started, the first one written actually was the story that concept comes from, and Address from the General, which was released in the first summer issue in 22. But I shit you not, during pre-production, when I had come up with this idea, a few nights into, I think, October, I'd order Chinese food. All right, order Chinese food. I get my crab rangoon, I got my wonton soup, I'm a happy man. As happy as a depressed college kid can be. At least I'm not on the street. At least I'm not dealing with the landlords. You know, I'm doing all right. I crack open a fortune cookie. And I am putting this on the screen for you all to see. This is the only time you will see anything on this video besides the lovely thumbnails I always assemble for you every time we do this show. I got a fortune that said there are 356 days in a year. May all 365 of your dreams come true. Yeah. That's when I knew I had to keep making this fucking series. That is the grand poobah of omens. But to answer the question, it really is tough to decide. But there are characters I have fun writing for, so let's start there before I, christen the all-time favorite. Professor Smith is a recent one because I just love John Pertwee's Doctor, so I love writing those mannerisms. And I can't do the voice at the moment. I'm still working on that. But I love the way he plays off of Lita, because Lita is this very streetwise punk sort of character. And so you have this buddy cop sort of dynamic between her and the old English Smith. And you have this wonderful banter between the two. And they're just so much fun as a duo. Lita is definitely a contender for probably flagship character of the series because she really does embody everything. She is this perfect cross-section of the rule of cool with the guns she uses. She's this perfect cross-section of the rule of cool with the car she drives. Because on one hand, the Red Devil is a tricked-out beast. It's a V8 in a VW Beetle. This thing will absolutely throttle you on a fucking quarter mile. And if not throttle you, it'll probably run you over and back over you and run you over a fucking again. But at the same time, it's still a VW Beetle. You look at the thing and you want to pick it up, you want to hug it, squeeze it, call it George, and take it and take it home with you for the rest of its life. It's an adorable looking car, but it also packs a wallop. And on top of that, she's also a cross section of rule of cool. By nature of how she's dressed. She's like literally half hippie, half punk. It's like fucking Harvey Dent of the fucking universe. Or on one hand, smokes dope, has all the denim, wears the fucking Birks. She'd be a model student at UCLA. or at I can't remember if it's Burlington or where the big Vermont college is that's known for its yeah, man. Campus attitude off the top of my head. I can't remember. On one hand, she's that. But on the other hand, she's walking around with a Wildy Hunter on her hip, a Dragunov in the back for a sniper rifle, and one of the craziest things my concept consultant on the series, Theo Schaefer, who's a high school bud of mine, ever showed me. The Mateba MTR-8. It's an Italian revolver, and it's the most cyberpunk-looking thing you'll fucking see. Look it up. It is bizarre. It is such a weird-looking character in and of itself. But, so she's got that. She's got the punk mohawk. She's got the attitude. She's got these literal crimson eyes. She's one of the... I get very particular about eye colors. Valentina has jades. I like the way jades are piercing. They have a strength to them. Lita is literally one of the only red-eyed characters in the entire series. I think she actually is the only known red-eyed character at the moment. She is this one-of-a-kind sort of hero. So there's that. Another character I like writing on the complete opposite end is Buck Sterling, who is this adventurer who goes rock climbing, goes hunting for treasure, does all these fun classic adventure hero things. I could write Hardy Boy style novels about him. He's a classic adventure character, but he's also a father of 3, I believe. Off the top of my head, again, folks, bear with me. Who is just this utter fucking love bug guy. You know, this gentle giant is the definitive definition. He is, you know, this incredible dad, this incredible husband. He takes great care of his right. He's a model citizen, basically. And he's also a Teflon sort of character, because you'll have all this chaos, all this angst surrounding him. And here he is, just being a cool dude, you know, being father of the fucking year all years, and, you know, just doing all these crazy tricks with his cars and stuff like that, and just being such a sweetheart. There's a reason why the Tales from the Frontline story for Winter 2023 was just the story of how he met his wife. Told from the wife's perspective. He is one of those characters that I really fell in love with writing, because I like those dynamics, and I like the fact that even amidst all the darkness, all the savagery, all the depravity, you get little bright spots like him. And he just came out of nowhere. I wrote him as a one-off character, and then I just slowly started developing him. I put him into a Speed Freak Files story on the rocks, where I think Nick says it's best, where it's like, you know, here we are, you know, all these badass looking dudes with fucking bullet belts and leather jacket and all this tough hombre stuff. And here we are being chauffeured by a fucking guy in Tevas at a tank top, being fucking chillaxed to the max, palling around in a fucking Jeep Cherokee that's school bus yellow. Drives like he's taking his kids to daycare. It's just, there's a level of cosmic contrast that I love that the character brings to this whole world. So he's another fun one. He is just a lovable guy. There are characters who I will just write because I'm like, you're fun, you're cute, I want to write more of you. Let's have some fun. Take them out to play with, basically. It's like if you have a garage full of cars and you got cars you don't often drive, and you're like, you deserve a day out. Get the fuck over here. We're going for a drive. That's the way I treat Buck Sterling. I'm so much fun as a character. But if I was to really play favorites, I am tempted to say, man. And you're getting to hear all these ums and ahs in real time, because it is hard. It is hard, because I can tell you a favorite character from each series. Some of them are, well, unfortunately, too easy. I mean, Urban Avenger, my favorite to write for, is Lita. No side character has eclipsed the sheer mania of her as a hero. No one. Not a soul. That said, you know, in the case of The Hunt, it's a toughie because, again, I love the lead character, Valentina. She's a very complex individual. I had mentioned at the top of the show that series in particular was inspired by a lot of my struggles with, like, mental health in college. But Valentina as a character herself, I just have so much fun writing with, because I like seeing characters evolve in the way she has, from being traumatized, confused, out of her gourd, to this very confident, you know, steely leader who later on, as the years roll by, will develop this very Ahabian obsession with finding and destroying this Colosseum. Very, very much a, you know, kind of a captain-driven mad sort of character. So I really like her, but also Marcus is another one of those, you know, you just want to, you know, wrap your arms around the guy and tell him everything's going to be all right. But not just that, but also he's just such a fascinating walking ball of contradictions, because when he started out, he was the worst off from his experiences with the Colosseum and with the conditioning to unlock all these primordial urges. He was the closest to going genuinely feral as any of these characters got. And so he is always sweet as can be, with the love of his life, with the friends he courts. But when crossed, when threatened with anything, death, inconvenience, he goes ballistic. It's a Jekyll and Hyde switch. So you have this in his early years, it's almost this childlike, peculiar innocence blended with this giant bestial rage. And then once he mellows out, at where he is now in the series, he is still trying to work through the sort of the residual stressors, but remains this very likable, lovable guy with this little hat. He has his little hobby of making Native American style beadwork and little things like that. And he's just such a fun character to write for. He always is nice, kind, a stand-up gentleman. But if you fuck him over, he comes back and knocks you out of the fucking atmosphere. You are gone, daddy gone, if you ever cross this guy. And so he's a very great character to write for, too. But similarly, I've put so much effort into Adam Knox, the character of General Knox, that I'm tempted to call him my all-time favorite. Because I just love the idea of this man, similarly driven to this Ahabian obsession, but with very good reasons to boot as well. You know, in the case of Valentina, it's sort of wielding the mental instability against the provider of it. But in Knox's case, it's quite literally, it becomes this very personal, private war for him, where it's, you took the love of my life, you took my arm, you made me not, completely, a flesh and blood being. You've taken so much of my life away that I want to take everything you've ever had and then some. It becomes a very, very revenge-based kind of war he's waging. But at the same time, it's strange too. I seem to loop back around to a sort of archetype of characters who will fuck your day up if you dare cross them. But when they're your pal for life. And I think the greatest example of that, and probably the moodiest example, is Grim Herrera. Captain Grim Herrera, who I've mentioned in the last episode we did, in reference to my affection for the Man in Black righting wrongs archetype, mostly inspired by Robert E. Howard's Solomon Kane, the dour Puritan. Grim Herrera is one of those characters that's just the living end, the physical embodiment of the series. Dressed in this gothic ensemble with the fringed leather trench coat, the little bolo tie with the eagle, the conchos everywhere, conchos on his harness boot straps, conchos on his hat band, conchos on his belts, all three of them. I think the eagle is his belt buckle, and the bolo tie is just a little turquoise one. It's a very thin, stringy sort of thing. It shows you the attention to detail I take with production design and costuming. But Grim Herrera as a character is sort of this quiet, always contemplating, always calculating, always trying to be one step ahead. And there's a good reason for it. And it's one of my favorite scenes I've ever written, where it is at the top of Caught in the Crosshairs. And it's a scene after a big induction ceremony where you have people that are being promoted to lieutenant, you have characters being brought into top brass, and Gibson Blanc being one of them, officially promoted to lieutenant. And there's a scene at a dinner table where he plucks up his very young daughter, and just because they're talking about how, after dinner, after all this, the next day everyone goes back to work as usual. And this is after a third faction has been introduced to the fight, the mysterious Black Country that seem to be chaos agents for the hell of it. And he just picks up his daughter and just quietly hugs her. Just quietly embraces her and just doesn't let go for a good solid minute. And and there's this knowing glance between his wife and Knox that's just like, yeah, this is gonna be this is gonna be a tough few days. You know, this is gonna be a tough few months. The game has changed, and there's this moment where even he, this unflappable, stoic sniper, captain of the auto corps, incredible driver, incredible man of insane skill, that he just needs one last hug from his daughter. And it's that little moment of vulnerability amidst all these, big hero moments that I give him throughout the series that kind of makes him probably my favorite character to write for. It's funny that I pick a side character, but I always think about him. I think about Grim Herrera more than I think about any other character, if I'm being perfectly honest, because he is such... There are layers to him that I want to explore further, and that I'm partly exploring through this parallel serial structure we're doing with our current year of stories. But I really want to explore more of him. And I think it's those layers, that depth, within the confines of this straight-ahead action-adventure series that makes him so compelling to me as a creator. So... God's honest truth, it's hard to pick favorites, but if I gun to head, I have to pick one. I say it's Grim Herrera. From the neo-Western badass look to the 50 cal sniper rifle to the jacked up International Harvester Scout to that little simple moment of tenderness against a backdrop of ruthless, calculating conduct in war. Grim Herrera is just a genuinely fun, fascinating character for me as a writer, but also for me as a reader. I love reading his stories back to myself. They're so much fun. And so gets the gears going in the mind. And with that, I am out of breath, out of steam, and I don't think I have anything else I can say at the moment. There is so much more going into this series than I can really comprehend. I might have to do a part 2 of this sometime, maybe next year. But for now, I hope the passion, the knowledge, and the sheer volume of information provided here gives you a small insight into the work that's been going into 365 Infantry. If you like what any of this sounds like, if you like what any of this even vaguely resembles in your mind's eye, I have links to more concrete explanations of the series in depth, the format of the magazine, why we do what we do, in the description, and of course, a link to the Kickstarter where you can buy annuals. If you need to get caught up, we've got a recruitment package, which is the first 2 years of stories in annual omnibus editions, buff to a shine. We have subscriptions to the quarterly magazine going into 2025. And we also have tons of add-ons, including packages of our audio show, FIREDALE. And we're also going to be working towards having audiobooks of the annuals available very, very soon. Not before the end of the campaign, probably going into next year, but we are going to be working on getting audiobooks of all these stories because there's a lot, and I know some of it goes down better on audio than it is sitting there and getting overwhelmed by the chapter list because we're not stopping. If you couldn't tell by the way I rambled throughout this entire episode, we're not stopping this series. I love it too much. I put too much work into it. And furthermore, I have the time of my life every time I'm writing this. Every time I'm writing stories for 365 Infantry, I am having an absolute ball. I'm getting to combine everything I love in fiction, in art, in entertainment, in one wild wolven package. If any of that sounds good to you, check the Kickstarter, and if not, check the Substack, because at least the Substack's free. That's all for now. Thank you all so much for listening to the end. Catch you on the flip side.